Oh my God.
Out on the edge of the Wild West, where dust swallowed footprints and hope didn't last long, there lived a man nobody bothered to remember. No land to his name, no family waiting at home, just a broken ranch fence and a life most folks rode right past. Then, one winter morning, he found them. 3 wild white colts, starving, abandoned, shaking in the cold like ghosts that hadn't learned how to disappear yet. Most men would have turned away. After all, what could a poor, unknown ranch hand possibly do with 3 half-dead wild horses? But he didn't walk on. He stayed, and that single choice, made in the dirt, with empty pockets and a tired heart, set off a chain of events no one in the territory saw coming. Not the ranchers, not the outlaws, not even the lawmen, because what those colts became, and what that forgotten man became with them, would stun the entire West. Before this story takes off, take a second to ride with us. Hit like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who loves real Wild West legends. This is Mr. Tiny Legends, where forgotten lives, untold ranch stories, and horseback legends finally get the spotlight they deserve. Out where the land flattened into a hard, endless line, the West had a way of erasing people. Not with violence, not with drama, just with time. Days stacked on days, wind over fences, silence over names. And that was how this man lived, quietly erased, mile by mile. No one in the territory spoke his name with any weight. In truth, most didn't speak it at all. He was just that fellow on the edge of nowhere. The poor one, the one with the leaning fence and the roof patched with whatever scrap he could find. If you asked the bigger ranchers, they'd shrug. If you asked the saloon keeper, he'd squint, think for a second, and say, "Oh, him." He wasn't born unlucky. The West rarely blamed birth. It blamed endurance. How long could you last before the land took more than it gave? His ranch, if you could even call it that, sat where the soil turned stubborn and the grass grew thin. 3 horses once grazed there. Then 2, then 1, then none. Drought had a cruel sense of humor, and it had laughed hardest at men with nothing saved for bad years. Every morning he rose before the sun. Not because he had somewhere important to be, but because lying awake in the dark reminded him of things he no longer had. A family once, a small herd once, a future that made sense. Those memories clung like burrs, and work, any work, was the only way to shake them loose. He took jobs no one else wanted, mending fences for richer men, clearing rocks, sleeping in barns that smelled of old hay and newer disappointment. Payment came in coins, sometimes in food, sometimes in promises that never quite ripened into reality. And still, he didn't complain. That's something the West notices, even when it pretends not to. He spoke little, but when he did, his words were steady. No boasting, no bitterness. He listened more than he talked, eyes always tracking the horizon like it might answer him back one day. People assumed he was broken. They were half right. Life had cracked him open. But it hadn't crushed what was inside. Not yet. There's a difference. At night, when the wind slid through the gaps in his cabin walls, he would sit by a weak fire and mend tack he no longer needed. Old habits die hard, especially when they're tied to better days. His hands knew leather the way a preacher knows scripture. He'd rub oil into cracked straps, not because anyone asked him to, but because caring for something, even useless things, kept him human. Sometimes he'd pause and stare at the empty corral outside his door. Horses had once filled that space. Real ones. Strong ones. Not dreams. Out here, horses weren't just animals. They were lifelines. Without them, a man was slow, vulnerable, invisible. And invisibility in the Wild West could be just as dangerous as being known. Winter that year came early and mean. Snow didn't fall gently. It arrived like a threat. Ranchers with full barns cursed the cold. Men like him felt it settle into their bones like a promise of suffering. He tightened his coat and kept moving. No one expected anything from him. That was the quiet cruelty of it. When you succeed, people cheer. When you fail, they judge. But when you hover in between, surviving without thriving, you become background. Part of the scenery, and the West has never cared about scenery. Still, something stubborn lived in him, a refusal to quit that didn't need applause. He didn't dream big anymore, but he hadn't stopped dreaming entirely. Sometimes, when the sky burned red at sunset, he imagined what it would feel like to ride again. Not fast, not proud, just steady. Horse and rider moving as one, like they used to. He never spoke that dream aloud, because saying things out loud in the West had a way of daring fate to laugh at you. The richer ranchers rode past his place without slowing. Their horses were fed, shod, groomed, strong animals with full bellies and polished tack. They didn't look his way. Why would they? Poverty makes people uncomfortable, and comfort was something the West guarded fiercely. Children didn't point. Adults didn't whisper. He had passed beyond judgment and landed in something colder. Indifference. And yet, he helped when asked. A pulled calf. A fence down after a storm. A neighbor's horse gone lame. He showed up. Did the work. Took what was offered, left without fuss. That kind of man doesn't shine, but he lasts. One evening, after a long day repairing a cattle pen for a rancher who paid him in beans and a sack of flour, he walked home under a sky thick with stars. The cold bit deep, his boots were worn thin. Each step kicked up frozen dirt that glittered like broken glass. He stopped near his corral again. Same habit, same silence. No horses. Just the creak of old wood and the sigh of the wind. He rested his hand on the fence rail, feeling the splinters. Closed his eyes. For a moment, just a moment, he allowed himself to imagine hoofbeats. Soft at first, then stronger. 3 sets, maybe. White shapes moving through the dusk. He shook his head, almost embarrassed by the thought. Fool, he muttered softly, more tired than angry. Dreams didn't feed a man. Dreams didn't survive winter. Inside his cabin he ate simply. Bread, beans, water warmed by the fire. He wrapped himself in a blanket patch so many times it barely remembered its original color. As sleep crept in, his body ached in familiar places. The ache of work, of cold, of years spent carrying more than his share. Outside, the wind howled. Far beyond his cabin, beyond the fences and the known trails, the wild country shifted under the snow. Coyotes moved, trees cracked. And somewhere, unseen, unheard by him, life teetered on the edge of ending. 3 lives, to be exact. But he didn't know that yet. All he knew was morning would come and he would rise again. Another day of surviving, another day of being unnoticed. And that, perhaps, was the most dangerous part of all. Because when a man has nothing left to lose, the smallest decision can change everything. Morning didn't arrive gently. It clawed its way over the horizon, pale and cold, dragging a grey sky behind it. The kind of dawn that made a man question why he bothered getting up at all. But he did, same as always, pulled on stiff boots, wrapped his coat tight, stepped outside to face whatever the land decided to throw at him next. The snow had deepened overnight. It lay heavy on the ground, muting the world. Even the wind seemed cautious, whispering instead of howling. He scanned the distance out of habit more than hope, eyes narrowing against the glare. That's when he noticed something wrong. Tracks, not cattle, not coyotes, horse tracks, fresh. They cut across the edge of his land, uneven and scattered, like the animals had been moving without direction. That alone was strange. Wild horses passed through now and then, but they traveled with purpose. These marks told a different story, one of panic or weakness. He followed them without thinking. Each step pulled him farther from his cabin, farther from safety. The snow grew deeper, swallowing his boots halfway to the knee. The tracks staggered, circled, doubled back on themselves. More signs appeared. Drag marks, shallow dents where bodies had rested, then struggled up again. His breath fogged thick in the cold. Something wasn't right. He crested a small rise, and that's when he saw them. 3 shapes huddled near a stand of bare trees, white against the snow. So white, they almost blended into the world around them, like spirits that hadn't fully decided to exist. Colts. Young. Too young to be alone. Their ribs showed beneath dull coats. Ice clung to their manes. One stood on shaking legs, head low. Another lay on its side, chest fluttering with shallow breaths. The third lifted its head when he moved closer, eyes wide and dark. filled with the kind of fear that came from knowing you were out of chances. For a long moment, he didn't move. Men in the West learned early not to rush toward wild things. Panic got animals killed. Panic got men killed too. He kept his hands visible, his steps slow, voice low and steady. "It's all right," he said softly, though he wasn't sure who he was trying to convince. The standing colt snorted weakly, stamping once before nearly losing its balance. That was when he knew. These weren't just lost. They were dying. Winter didn't show mercy to the young or the foolish, and these colts had been both. Maybe their herd moved on without them. Maybe a storm scattered them. Maybe they'd been chased or hurt, or simply too slow. The reason didn't matter now. What mattered was time. He crouched several yards away, lowering himself to their level. His eyes moved over them with the practiced glance of a man who had once known horses well. Frostbite on the ears, cracked hooves. One colt's flank twitched with every breath, a sign of exhaustion that ran deeper than hunger. He swallowed. Helping them would be foolish. That thought came quick and sharp, like the crack of a whip. He had no feed, no proper shelter, no horses of his own anymore. Taking in 3 wild colts wasn't kindness. It was suicide by slow starvation. Any sensible man would turn around. And yet he stayed. Maybe it was the way the smallest colt tried to stand when he shifted closer, legs trembling, refusing to lie down again. Maybe it was the look in their eyes. Not wild rage, but confusion. Like they couldn't understand how the world had abandoned them so completely. Or maybe a man who had been forgotten saw something familiar in 3 creatures the West had decided were expendable. He stood and backed away slowly, careful not to spook them. His mind raced. He needed something. Anything. Food, warmth, time. All 3 were in short supply. The walk back to his cabin felt longer than usual. Snow soaked through his boots. Cold bit at his fingers, but his thoughts burned hot. If he left them, they'd be gone by nightfall. If he brought them in, he might lose what little he had left. When he reached his corral, he didn't pause this time. He threw open the gate, clearing old debris with frantic energy. He hauled out rotten boards, packed snow into windbreaks, dragged spare canvas across one corner to block the worst of the wind. It wasn't much, but it was something. He returned to the colt slowly, carrying a sack with the last of his grain mixed with warm water, hoping it would be enough to get them moving. He poured some onto the snow a few yards away and stepped back. The boldest colt sniffed first, took a hesitant step, then another. Its head dropped, muzzle touching the grain, and it began to eat with desperate, awkward movements. The others followed. Watching them eat hurt more than the cold ever could. He knew what that food meant. It meant hunger later. It meant nights with an emptier stomach than usual. It meant risk. But he also knew this. Letting them die would cost him something too. One by one, he coaxed them toward his land. No ropes, no force. Just patience. The kind patience teaches you when nothing in life comes quickly. They reached the corral just as the light began to fade. The colts hesitated at the gate, unsure. He stepped inside first, turned his back to them, and waited. After a moment, hooves crunched behind him. They followed. Inside the shelter, the wind softened. He spread what hay he could find. Old, dry, but edible. He checked each colt carefully, keeping his movements calm. The smallest one leaned against him for a brief second, then pulled away, startled by its own trust. That moment stayed with him. As night fell, he sat outside the corral, wrapped in his coat, listening to the sound of 3 living creatures breathing behind him. The cold pressed in. Hunger gnawed. But for the first time in a long while, the emptiness around his cabin felt different. Not quite so empty. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know how he'd manage tomorrow or the day after that. All he knew was this. The West had thrown something fragile into his path. And instead of stepping aside, he had chosen to stand in its way. Sometimes, that's all it takes to start a legend. The first night nearly broke him. Cold sank into the ground like it intended to stay forever. He slept in short, restless pieces, waking again and again to listen for sounds from the corral. A sudden crash, a panicked whinny. The silence that meant something had gone terribly wrong, but the sounds that reached him were quieter than he expected. Shuffling hooves, slow breathing, the soft, uncertain snort of animals not yet convinced they'd live to see morning. At dawn, he was on his feet before the sky changed color. His breath came out in white clouds as he stepped into the corral, moving carefully, speaking low. The colts watched him with wide eyes, bodies stiff, ready to bolt even though their legs still trembled from weakness. Wild horses weren't like ranch stock. They didn't understand hands or ropes or fences. Everything was a threat until proven otherwise. And proof, in their world, came slow. He started with distance. Each morning he brought water warmed over the fire so it wouldn't freeze too fast. He placed feed on the ground, then backed away. He didn't stare, didn't reach. He let them decide how close was safe. Days passed like that. His own meals shrank. What little grain he'd saved for himself went to them instead. Hunger hollowed his cheeks, but he wore it without complaint. A man could survive being hungry. These colts couldn't survive being rushed. The smallest one worried him most. It lagged behind the others, moved stiffly, favoring one front leg. He watched closely, waiting for the signs every horseman feared, the dull eyes, the refusal to rise, the quiet surrender. They never came. Instead, the colt fought. It struggled up each morning, even when it would have been easier to stay down. That kind of will spoke louder than words. By the end of the first week, their coats began to change. Still rough, still thin, but no longer lifeless. A faint shine returned, like a promise not fully kept yet. They started to move with more purpose, circling the corral, testing the boundaries, testing him. The first real challenge came without warning. He was inside the corral, fixing a loose board, when one colt spooked. A sudden movement, a shadow crossing the sun, panic exploded, hooves struck wood. The colts bolted as one, slamming into the fence, eyes rolling white with terror. One misstep. One bad fall, that would be the end. He dropped his tools and stepped back, hands raised, voice calm but firm, not shouting, never shouting. Shouting told a wild animal it was already too late. "Easy," he murmured. "Easy now." The words didn't matter. The tone did. Slowly, the chaos settled, breathing steadied, the fence held. When it was over, his legs shook as badly as theirs had. That night, he reinforced the corral under moonlight, fingers numb, mind racing. He realized then what he'd truly taken on. Feeding them was only the beginning. Keeping them alive meant keeping them from themselves. Breaking wild spirits wasn't about domination. It was about teaching fear when it was unnecessary and respect when it wasn't. He began to sit with them. Not close, just close enough. Hours passed that way. Him on an upturned bucket, them watching from across the corral. Sometimes one would step forward, sometimes they'd retreat. He let it happen. Trust, he knew, was not something you chased. It came when it was ready. The first touch happened on the 10th day. The smallest colt again. It edged closer than the others, curiosity outweighing caution. He didn't move, didn't breathe too loudly. When the colt's muzzle brushed his sleeve, the contact was so light he almost missed it. Almost. The colt flinched back immediately, startled by its own boldness. But it didn't run. He closed his eyes and smiled. From that moment on, progress came in inches instead of miles, but it came all the same. He began brushing them with a rag tied to a stick, extending his reach without forcing closeness. They snorted, danced away, then returned. Day by day they learned his scent, his voice, the rhythm of his movements. Winter loosened its grip just enough to let hope breathe. Then came the visitors. 2 riders passed by one afternoon, slowing when they saw the white shapes in his corral. Their horses were strong, well-fed, their coats clean. The riders themselves wore the kind of confidence that came from security. One of them laughed. "Where'd you get those ghosts, old man?" He didn't answer right away, just kept brushing, slow and steady. "They were left to die," he said finally. The laughter faded. The riders exchanged a look. "Wild stock's trouble," the other said. "You'd be smarter to sell 'em cheap while you can, or let nature take its course." They rode on without waiting for his reply. Their words stayed. Trouble, cheap, nature's course. That night, he thought long and hard about what he was doing, about how thin the line was between stubborn kindness and foolish pride. about how the West didn't reward men for saving what it had already decided to discard. But every time doubt crept in, he remembered that first touch, that fragile moment of trust. You don't betray something like that. Training began in earnest once the Colts grew stronger. Simple things. Teaching them the feel of a halter without panic. Letting them drag a rope until it became part of the world instead of a threat. Rewarding calm with quiet praise and a handful of grain. There were setbacks, days when fear flared again, days when he went to bed wondering if he was in over his head. And then one morning, something changed. The Colts didn't scatter when he entered the corral. They turned toward him, all three. It wasn't obedience, not yet. But it was acknowledgement, the kind that said, "We see you." Out in the wider territory, rumors had begun to stir. 3 white colts, a poor rancher, wild horses growing tame where they should have failed. People were starting to look his way, and in the West, attention, wanted or not, never arrived alone. The first sign of trouble didn't come with raised voices or drawn guns. It came quietly, riding on curiosity. More riders began passing his land. Some slowed, some stopped. A few leaned on their saddles and watched in silence as the 3 white colts moved inside the corral. Stronger now, steadier, coats beginning to shine like fresh snow under sun. People noticed things like that. In a land where survival was measured daily, improvement stood out. Word spread the way it always did in the West. Slowly at first, then all at once. By the time spring hinted at its return, folks weren't asking if the story was true. They were asking how. How'd you keep 'em alive? Why'd you bother? Those worth anything yet? He answered simply. No speeches, no pride. He talked about feed, patience, quiet hands. About letting fear burn itself out instead of fighting it. Some listened, most didn't. Men with full barns rarely believed lessons from men with empty ones. But they watched. And watching turned into measuring. One afternoon, a well-dressed rancher rode in uninvited. His horse was the kind that made a statement before the rider ever spoke. Muscular, groomed, expensive. The man dismounted slowly, eyes never leaving the colts. "White stock like this doesn't come around often," he said casually, "especially 3 at once." The rancher offered a price without asking permission. It wasn't generous, but it was more money than the poor man had held in years. He didn't answer right away. The rancher smiled thinly. "You'd be smart to take it. Wild horses don't stay calm forever." The poor man rested his hand on the corral fence, feeling the familiar splinters. "They ain't for sale." The smile faded. That was the moment things changed, not because he refused the money, but because word of that refusal traveled faster than the story of the rescue ever had. People didn't understand turning down profit, especially not in the West, especially not from a man who needed it. Some called him foolish, others called him stubborn. A few began to look at the Colts with different eyes, not as lives saved, but as opportunities lost. Pressure came in small ways at first. Fences found broken in the night, feed sacks gone missing, a gate left open just wide enough to cause trouble. He fixed what he could, replaced what he couldn't, never accused, never complained, but he noticed. So did the Colts. They grew alert again, tension creeping back into their movements. Horses read the world faster than men ever could. Unease traveled down the fence rails and into their bones. He adjusted his routine, stayed closer, slept lighter, kept a rifle near not to threaten but to remind. Then came the challenge no patience could solve. A local event, a spring horse trial, was announced in the nearest town. A gathering of ranchers, breeders, traders. Skill, strength, and value on full display. It was where reputations were made and broken. Someone mentioned the Colts. Laughed, even. Wild ghosts raised by a nobody? I'd pay to see that. The words reached him like sparks. If he stayed hidden, the pressure would only grow. People would keep circling, testing, pushing. But if he stepped into the open, if he showed what those Colts had become, everything would change, for better or worse. The decision weighed heavy. Entering the trial meant exposure, judgment, risk. If the Colts failed, he'd confirm every doubt people had ever held about him. If they succeeded, Well, success in the West drew attention just as sharp as failure. The night before he left, he sat with the Colts under a sky full of stars. He spoke to them softly, more to steady himself than them. "We'll go slow," he said, "together." The journey to town turned heads before they even arrived. 3 white horses moving in calm step, guided by a man most folks barely recognized. Whispers followed them down the street. "Those are the wild ones!" Didn't think they'd last the winter. Who's the fellow leading them? The trial grounds buzzed with confidence and noise. Strong horses, louder owners. Men who'd built names on generations of breeding and money. No one paid much attention to him, until they did. The first test was simple handling. Leading, turning, stopping. The Colts moved with quiet precision, responding to his voice and body like they'd known him all their lives. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The second test raised eyebrows. Light work, pulling, obedience under distraction. One Colt hesitated when a banner snapped in the wind, but recovered without panic. Recovery mattered. By the final test, the laughter had stopped. The Colts weren't the strongest, they weren't the fastest. But they were calm, willing, balanced in a way that couldn't be taught through force. People leaned forward now. When the results were announced, no grand prize was handed to him, no ribbon placed in his hand. But something else happened. Respect shifted. Offers came again, higher this time. Serious ones. He turned them all down. And that stunned everyone. On the ride home, he felt the weight of eyes on his back. Admiration from some, frustration from others. The West had taken notice, and it didn't like being surprised. Back at his ranch, he reinforced the fences again, checked the locks, trusted his instincts, because when the West realizes it misjudged someone, it doesn't always forgive. And somewhere beyond his land, plans were already forming. The West didn't forget what it had seen. In the weeks after the trial, silence followed him like a shadow. Not the empty kind he was used to, but a watchful one. Riders passed his land more often now. Some waved, some didn't. Every man measured him differently than before. He was no longer invisible. That came with a cost. One night, the dogs down the road barked without stopping. He woke instantly, hand already on his coat. The wind carried a sound that didn't belong, hoofbeats where there shouldn't be any. He reached the corral just in time to see 2 figures retreat into the dark, one cursing softly as a white shape lunged forward, ears pinned, teeth flashing. The Colts didn't run. They stood, together. The fence held. The intruders didn't return. By morning, word spread fast. Someone had tried to take the horses, failed, and just like that, the tone changed again. People began stopping by in daylight. Not to bargain, but to talk. Old ranchers with weathered faces, horsemen who'd been quiet observers until now. They asked questions, real ones this time, about training, about patience, about what it meant to earn an animal's trust instead of breaking its will. He answered the same way he always had, plainly. One of the older men said something that stuck. "You didn't tame 'em, you taught 'em, that was the truth of it." The turning point came when a severe storm swept through the territory, sudden and violent. Fences failed, horses scattered, panic ruled the night. When the storm broke, neighbors were missing stock and hope. They came to him, not because he was rich, not because he was powerful, but because he understood horses others couldn't reach anymore. He rode out with the 3 white horses at dawn. Not fast, not reckless. The Colts moved with confidence now, steady through mud and debris. They tracked scent, sound, movement, skills born of the wild and sharpened by trust. By nightfall, they had located lost animals others had written off, guided them home. Calm, where panic would have made things worse. The West noticed something then that money couldn't buy: reliability. From that day on, work found him. Fair work, honest work. He never grew wealthy, not in the way the big ranchers did, but he grew secure. Enough feed, strong fences, a roof that didn't leak. In the Colts, they grew into legends of their own, not show horses, not trophies. Working horses with sharp minds and steady hearts. People requested them by name, though few remembered the man's. He didn't mind. One offer came late in the year, an official one. A chance to sell the horses to a distant buyer for more money than he'd ever imagined. Enough to change his life overnight. He thought about it long and hard, then he declined, because some things weren't meant to be sold. Years passed. The white horses aged gracefully, their coats still bright against the land that had nearly killed them once. Children grew up hearing the story, not of rich ranchers or gunfighters, but of a poor man who saw value where others saw waste. They said the West had tested him, but the truth was simpler. The West had overlooked him, and when it finally looked back, it realized too late that it had been standing beside a legend all along. He never asked for recognition, never carved his name into history. But his story traveled anyway, carried on hoofbeats, whispered over fences, passed from one rider to the next. A reminder that legends aren't born rich. They're forged in quiet choices, made when no one is watching,